Welcome to the deep dive. It's really great to have you with us today.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
If you've ever looked at the state of modern governance, the bureaucracy, the gridlock, the persistent frustrations of just navigating civic life, and found yourself wondering why it all feels so irreparably broken, well, you aren't alone.
No, you definitely aren't.
But today, we're going to look at this issue through a very specific lens. We're stepping completely away from typical partisan debates and the daily news cycle. Instead, we're looking at the state not as some mystical, unchangeable entity, but quite simply as a machine.
Right.
And like any machine, if it isn't functioning properly, it can be diagnosed, deconstructed, and fundamentally redesigned.
That's the exact framework we're operating within today. We're taking an engineering and systems theory approach to human governance. Our source material is a comprehensive, highly structured university lecture delivered by Professor Wojciech.
Titled Democracy and Political System.
Exactly. And the objective here is to systematically break down the structural flaws in our current political frameworks and, more importantly, to propose blueprints for what could be considered an optimal system.
It's a highly analytical approach.
It is. It strips the emotion out of politics and replaces it with logic, structural design, and an understanding of human incentives.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second, because if we want to fix a machine, we have to know what it's supposed to do and who it's supposed to serve.
That is the foundation of this entire discussion. It starts with defining democracy.
We all throw around the phrase rule of the people, but the core vulnerability in our current system is how we actually define the people. I mean, are we talking about taxpayers? Are we talking about everyone who physically resides within a border?
This raises an important question about what we falsely accept as democracy. It's a fundamental question, and one we rarely stop to examine because we assume the answer is obvious. But when we say the people rule, what does that actually mean in practice? The lecture prompts us to consider the parameters of that definition. Does the people mean a specific ethnic group?
Like in a nation state.
Yes. In a nation state, does the concept of the people only apply to the dominant ethnicity, regardless of where they live in the world? Or does it mean everyone who resides within a country's physical borders, regardless of their citizenship status?
These aren't just philosophical musings.
Not at all. The way a constitution defines the people determines exactly who gets to operate the levers of the machine.
Right. Or to look at it from a purely economic perspective, are the people strictly the ones who pay taxes? It forces you to realize that the core subject of democracy isn't a fixed, universally agreed upon concept.
And this leads to an even more personal question.
Which is, am I the people? If I'm an individual whose views completely differ from the vast majority around me, how much power do I actually have in this machine?
Precisely. If your voice never aligns with the winning side, are you still part of the ruling class in a democracy? Or are you just a subject living under the rule of a dominant group?
This brings us to a severe structural flaw.
Yes, the concept of the permanent minority. In our current models, the mechanics are quite blunt. You win a mathematical majority, and you get to rule.
You make the decisions.
Right. And in politics, preferences can shift. You might vote for a losing party today, but perhaps they win in the next cycle. That's a temporary minority, and it's a normal part of the process.
But what if your minority status is fixed?
Exactly. What if you are a national or ethnic minority or a demographic minority whose fundamental needs and interests will never mathematically cross that 51% threshold?
Wait, but isn't that just the harsh reality of math? I mean, if 51% of the population wants a specific policy, shouldn't they get it? Why is that considered a flaw rather than just a functioning democracy doing what it's supposed to do?
Because a system that permanently disenfranchises a minority cannot be considered an optimal democracy. It functions more like a structural dictatorship.
A structural dictatorship?
Yes. We often equate democracy with simple majority rule, the idea that 51% of the population gets to enforce its will 100% of the time over the remaining 49%.
Right, winner takes all.
But structurally, that is a systemic failure. Even a minority has rights. And we aren't just talking about fundamental human rights like the right to be free from unjust imprisonment.
Which most constitutions theoretically guarantee anyway.
Exactly. We're talking about the right to have a proportionate say in the actual decisions being made. The idea that a narrow majority simply takes all the power and dictates all the terms is a deeply flawed algorithm for governance.
Which clarifies what democracy is not. It's often easier to define a system by outlining its negative space.
It is.
We accept a lot of practices as democratic simply because we've grown used to them. But if we look at the machine objectively, democracy is obviously not an oligarchy, the rule of a small elite group.
Yeah.
It's not the rule of a single individual acting on behalf of that oligarchy. And crucially, it is not the direct dictatorship of a 51% majority.
If 51% of the population decides to appropriate the resources of the other 49%, that is not democracy in an optimal sense. It's just mathematically sanctioned theft. An optimal system has to account for everyone within its borders.
So if a simple majority rule isn't the answer, how do we usually try to implement democracy? We currently rely on two main avenues: direct democracy and representative democracy.
Let's examine direct democracy first.
The romantic appeal here is undeniable. Every citizen has an equal voice, everyone votes on everything. It's the pure and unadulterated power of the public.
It sounds like the perfect machine.
It really does sound ideal in theory because you eliminate the middlemen entirely. But when applied to a large-scale modern society, this model contains fatal systemic flaws.
The first and most obvious flaw is sluggishness. The process of direct democracy is incredibly slow.
Because you have to gather consensus.
Right. Gathering consensus, ensuring everyone has read the relevant material, allowing time for deliberation, and finally organizing a vote takes an immense amount of time.
You see this in student plenums.
Yes, which are a pure form of direct democracy. They can drag on for hours or even days just to reach a conclusion that a competent administrator could have made in 10 seconds.
A state requires swift, efficient decision-making to function.
Which direct democracy simply cannot provide on a daily basis.
And tied directly to that sluggishness is the sheer cost. Organizing a nationwide referendum for every major decision is astronomically expensive.
You have to organize commissions, print ballots, distribute them, count them securely.
And then you have to factor in the lost economic productivity of an entire population taking a day off to vote. It's entirely unsustainable for day-to-day governance.
But beyond the logistics of time and money, there's a much more uncomfortable systemic flaw, which is competence.
Right. It's a difficult truth to confront, but it's essential for system design.
The general public simply lacks the specific competence required to evaluate complex, highly technical data.
Let's use a national infrastructure project as an example.
Perfect. Imagine holding a nationwide direct vote on whether to build a new highway system. Most citizens do not possess the expertise to evaluate traffic volume projections.
I certainly don't.
Exactly. They don't know whether the specific cost per kilometer is justified compared to similar global projects, or how to assess the long-term impact on the state's macroeconomic stability.
These aren't matters of opinion.
No, they are objective facts that require specialized knowledge.
I can hear people arguing that this sounds a bit elitist, though. Shouldn't the public have a say in where their tax dollars go, even if they aren't civil engineers?
They absolutely should have a say in the ultimate goal, but they shouldn't be making the highly technical engineering decisions required to get there.
Because when you ask an uninformed public to make technical decisions, you introduce massive instability into the system.
And because the public is often uninformed or simply too busy with their own lives to research every single technical issue, they become incredibly vulnerable to the fourth major flaw of direct democracy.
Manipulation.
Manipulation. The people framing the questions hold immense power.
If you control the wording of the ballot, you often control the outcome.
A very specific historical example illustrates this perfectly from the lecture. The 1991 referendum in Croatia, right as the dissolution of Yugoslavia was beginning.
This is a prime example of structural manipulation within a direct democracy. Let's look closely at that. How was the wording weaponized?
Instead of asking voters a simple direct question like, do you want to immediately secede from Yugoslavia? The question was layered and highly complex.
Right, it wasn't a simple yes or no to secession.
No. It asked if the voters supported the right of the republic to, quote, negotiate with other republics about a possible new structure, referencing their constitutional right to sovereignty and independence.
Naturally, a large portion of the population, including those who simply wanted peaceful negotiations and a restructured, looser federation, voted yes.
They were voting for the right to negotiate.
But the system processed that vote very differently.
Yes. The leadership immediately utilized that yes vote, which contained the phrase regarding the right to independence, as a definitive public mandate to unilaterally declare outright secession in the parliament almost immediately afterward.
It demonstrates how a direct vote can be weaponized by the architects of the referendum.
You think you're voting for one outcome, but the wording allows the executive power to interpret it as something entirely different. Because of the time constraints, the lack of technical competence, and this vulnerability to manipulation, people often end up voting against their own interests without even realizing it.
So direct democracy is highly flawed as a primary operating system, which brings us to the alternative we all live with today: representative democracy.
Right.
We acknowledge we don't have the time or the expertise to vote on every highway and trade deal, so we elect people to make these decisions for us. Problem solved.
Hardly. Representative democracy carries even greater systemic weaknesses. They are just structured differently.
The most glaring issue is the complete loss of citizen influence post-election.
Think about the mechanics of the current system. We go to the polls, we cast our vote, and then for the next several years, the voter becomes entirely irrelevant to the daily operation of the machine.
The representative has no legal obligation to consult you, listen to you, or even acknowledge your existence until the next election cycle begins.
It's essentially the illusion of choice. You get to pick who gets to ignore you for the next 4 years.
And if they act entirely against your interests, what are your options? Your only real recourse is the exhausting and highly inefficient route of civil disobedience.
You have to organize protests, go on strike, or block streets.
You are forced to expend a massive amount of personal and collective energy just to exert a tiny bit of influence on the person you already elected to represent you.
And we have to ask why these representatives so reliably end up ignoring the public interest. It isn't just a matter of electing the wrong people.
It's an environmental inevitability.
There's an Albanian proverb cited in the lecture that perfectly illustrates the mechanics of systemic corruption.
The sweet fingers of the beekeeper.
Yes.
I think that analogy perfectly captures the quiet, almost natural progression of corruption.
It does. Think about the state budget, the national treasury, as the honey. When you elect a representative, you are putting them in charge of managing vast amounts of resources.
And the proverb implies that while a beekeeper is transferring the honey from the hive to the jars, it is physically inevitable that their fingers will get sticky.
They are going to taste the honey. In a political system, the person managing the money is constantly surrounded by the temptation to divert a little bit of that wealth toward themselves, their family, their friends, or their political allies.
So corruption isn't just an accident or a moral failing of a few bad apples.
No, it's an environmental inevitability. When you put a human being that close to the honey without stringent overlapping controls, the fingers get sticky.
Even if a representative enters office with pure intentions and initially resists the temptation, the environment itself, the oligarchy, and the established power structures around them will often pressure them into compliance.
If they don't play the game, they're simply removed or neutralized by the system.
And that leads right into the issue of lobbying and monopolies. Think about the sheer weight of modern lobbying.
You elect a representative based on a specific set of campaign promises.
But the minute they take office, wealthy entities, corporations, and special interest groups can essentially purchase their votes on specific legislation.
The citizen's voice is instantly neutralized. The representative is swayed by the financial weight of the lobbyist, not the voice of the voter back home.
In a system designed this way, the very foundation of representation collapses into a transactional market.
Which brings us to a critical juncture in this analysis. We've examined the deep structural flaws of direct democracy, the sluggishness, the lack of competence, the manipulation.
And we've laid bare the inevitable corruption and disenfranchisement of representative democracy.
If we view the state strictly as an engineering problem, neither of these components works effectively on its own. They both fail to maintain a stable, optimal environment.
So we're stuck choosing between two broken machines.
Not necessarily. The synthesis of these ideas suggests that we don't have to accept this binary choice.
We can merge the best elements of both systems while actively mitigating their weaknesses.
And the key to this synthesis lies in fundamentally redefining the job description of the representative.
Let's explore that. Because in the current model, the representative makes decisions for the public. They are the deciders.
The proposed shift moves their role from decision-making to curation over decision.
It's a subtle distinction, but it changes the entire power dynamic.
We can use a restaurant analogy to clarify this. When you go to a restaurant, you don't want to go into the kitchen, inspect every single ingredient, negotiate the wholesale price of flour, and figure out the exact cooking temperatures for the ovens.
That requires time and specific culinary competence you likely don't have.
That represents the flaw of pure direct democracy. It demands too much of the consumer.
But on the flip side, you also don't want the chef to simply bring you a meal of their choosing, entirely ignoring your preferences, and then force you to pay for it.
That's the flaw of pure representative democracy.
Exactly. What you actually want is a menu.
The new role of the representative is to act as that highly competent chef who curates a viable, well-researched menu of alternatives.
So the representative uses their specific expertise to study the infrastructure project, analyze the budget, ensure all the engineering standards are met,
And then present 3 or 4 realistic, thoroughly vetted options to the public.
and then the power shifts back.
Yes. The public then uses direct democracy to select their preferred option from that curated menu. The representative does not decide for you. They merely define the viable, safe choices.
You prioritize direct democracy whenever it is feasible, but it is always safely guided by representative expertise.
It neutralizes the public's lack of technical competence while eliminating the representative's ability to make unilateral decisions against the public interest.
You get the efficiency and the technical rigor of the representative combined with the ultimate authority of the citizen.
And speaking of ultimate authority, let's talk about the most potent leverage in any state.
Money. The synthesis includes a highly specific feature regarding the national budget. It involves implementing a form of direct tax allocation.
This is a fascinating mechanical bypass for the sticky fingers of the beekeeper. The proposal allows citizens to directly allocate a portion of the taxes they pay to specific programs of their own choosing.
How does that actually function in practice? I mean, if everyone just chooses where their taxes go, doesn't the state collapse?
It wouldn't be the entirety of your tax burden, but a designated percentage. Instead of handing all your money directly to the representative and simply hoping they spend it wisely, you retain the structural power to direct those funds.
If a large enough group of citizens independently allocates their portion of funds to a specific social program, a local infrastructure project, or a scientific initiative, that program gets funded directly.
It completely bypasses the traditional bureaucratic monopolies. You never let the corrupt hands touch the money in the first place.
You defund corruption by rerouting the financial architecture.
Exactly. It places financial power directly in the hands of the individuals, acting as a profound check on the representative's power. Now, to truly understand how these new mechanisms would integrate into a functioning state, we need to introduce the broader framework used in this analysis.
Right, systems theory, specifically looking at how stability is maintained. Here's where it gets really interesting.
Let's look at systems theory. We're talking about cybernetics here, which, in simple terms, is the science of communications and automatic control systems in both machines and living things.
It's about how a system steers itself and corrects its own errors.
And the analogy used to explain this in the context of a government is remarkably grounded. We're going to map the entire apparatus of the state to a common household refrigerator.
It's an excellent analogy because a refrigerator operates on a classic negative feedback loop. Its sole objective is to maintain a stable internal environment despite external disruptions.
Like someone opening the door and letting warm air in, or the temperature of the room dropping.
If we map the components of a refrigerator to the traditional branches of government, the structural flaws of our current system become glaringly obvious. Let's build the fridge. First, you have the person who sets the thermostat.
They decide what the goal is. They say, the standard for this environment is 4 degrees Celsius.
In our governmental model, this represents the legislative branch. The legislature, representing the will of the people, sets the laws and defines the standards that the state is supposed to maintain.
Correct. The legislature defines the goal. 4 degrees. Next, you have the executive branch. In our refrigerator, this is the actuator.
It's the compressor, the motor.
This is the heavy machinery that actually does the physical work. When it turns on, it pumps the coolant and lowers the temperature.
Crucially, the executive branch's only job is to execute the actions necessary to achieve the standards set by the legislature. It doesn't decide what the temperature should be, it just does the work to get it there.
And then you have the judicial branch. In systems theory, this is known as the comparator.
The judiciary looks at the rules, the 4-degree standard, and it looks at the actions being taken by the citizens and the state, and it checks for conflicts or deviations.
It acts as a balancing mechanism, stepping in when things go out of bounds or when the rules are broken. But here is where the traditional model fails as an engineering schematic.
Because if you just have a thermostat setting the goal, a compressor to do the cooling, and a comparator looking for legal errors, how do you actually know what the temperature inside the fridge is at any given moment?
You need a thermometer. You need a sensor.
Precisely. Without a dedicated sensor to objectively measure reality, the compressor doesn't know when it needs to turn on or off, and the comparator has no factual data to evaluate.
Modern governments essentially operate without a dedicated sensor. We have branches to make the rules, execute the rules, and judge the rules. But we lack an independent, constitutionally protected apparatus whose sole function is to simply measure reality and detect deviations from the goal.
This leads directly to the proposal for a new fourth branch of government.
A fourth branch. Let's call it the control branch.
Do we really need more government? Isn't the bureaucracy bloated enough?
It isn't about adding bureaucracy. It's about adding a necessary sensory organ to a blind machine. The control branch's entire existence is dedicated to observation.
It is a purely observational branch whose only job is to constantly objectively measure the actual state of the nation.
It compares it to the laws passed by the legislature and detects any deviation from that 4-degree goal. It gathers the data on the economy, on infrastructure, on civic well-being, and provides the objective truth that the other branches need to function.
To understand why an independent control branch is so necessary, we have to look at the philosophy behind the separation of powers. We often cite Lord Acton. Absolute power corrupts absolutely.
But there's another crucial insight from Acton regarding federalism and the division of power.
Yes. Acton argued that liberty consists in the division of power. If you want freedom, you cannot allow power to concentrate.
But his specific view on federalism flips our modern understanding upside down. We tend to think of federalism as a top-down structure, a massive central government in the capital that graciously hands down a little bit of authority to local municipalities.
Right, like the central government is the parent and the local governments are the children getting an allowance of power.
Acton argued the exact opposite. True federalism means that power naturally and inherently resides at the lowest, most local levels. The local community, the municipality, retains the vast majority of the power over their daily lives.
They only pass specific, necessary duties upward to a central authority, things like national defense or interstate trade, things the local level physically cannot handle.
Power is delegated upward, not downward. This structural design inherently prevents the central accumulation of power that inevitably leads to absolutism.
So, keeping that philosophy of extreme division in mind, let's look at the power dynamics of this new fourth control branch. If we create a new branch of government, how do we ensure it doesn't just become a new tyrannical power center?
What stops the sensor from taking over the machine?
Exactly.
The structural limitations placed on it must be absolute. We can use a sports analogy to clarify its role. The control branch operates exactly like the VAR room, the video assistant referee in modern football, or a sideline judge in tennis.
I like that. The VAR room sits away from the pitch. They have all the monitors, they have all the angles, they can see every interaction clearly. But they don't get to kick the ball.
Exactly. They hold absolutely no executive power. They cannot write the rules of the game, so they possess no legislative power.
And they do not issue the final red card or assign the penalty. They have no judicial power.
Their only job is to watch the play, measure it against the established rulebook, and blow the whistle when someone is offside or a foul is committed. They provide the objective data to the referee.
So they act purely as an alarm system. This adds an entirely new dimension to the concept of checks and balances.
The traditional model we all learned in school, championed by thinkers like Locke and Montesquieu, relies on 3 branches checking each other. It's often compared to the simple game of rock, paper, scissors.
Rock crushes scissors, scissors cuts paper, paper covers rock. It's a closed 3-way loop of mutual restriction.
But that simple triangular structure is relatively fragile. If one branch manages to align with or overpower another, say, the executive branch manages to stack the judicial branch with loyalists, the whole triangle collapses into an autocracy.
By introducing a fourth, entirely independent variable like the control branch, you dramatically increase the complexity of the system.
It transitions the model from rock, paper, scissors to the expanded version of the game. Rock, paper, scissors, lizard, Spock.
It's a great analogy for systems engineering. In the expanded game, the web of interactions is much denser. Spock vaporizes rock, but the lizard poisons Spock.
The lizard eats paper, but scissors decapitate the lizard. Because there are more independent actors, each possessing specific limited powers against the others, it becomes exponentially harder for any single actor to dominate the entire game.
Adding the control branch creates a much more complex, resilient web of mutual restriction.
The fundamental rule of systems engineering here is that the more independent control mechanisms you have, the more stable the system becomes. even if the individuals running those branches are highly flawed, selfish, or incompetent.
If we connect this to the bigger picture,
If you want the ultimate extreme historical example of overlapping controls locking a system in place, look at the architecture of the Third Reich.
and we are looking at this purely from an objective structural engineering perspective.
It is absolutely vital to separate the ideological goals for the structural mechanics here. The goals of that regime were horrific, evil, and entirely destructive to humanity. However, if you look at it strictly as an engineering problem, how did such a regime maintain such immense internal stability while fighting the major world powers for years, dealing with internal dissent and managing a massive state apparatus?
It wasn't through trust or unity.
No, it was through structurally enforced paranoia. Hitler was deeply paranoid of his own subordinates. So instead of creating one massive unified intelligence and security agency that could potentially grow strong enough to overthrow him, he created three mutually hostile agencies.
The Abwehr under Canaris, the SS under Himmler, and the Gestapo under Goering.
These three leaders despised each other. They were constantly watching, investigating, and checking each other's power, fiercely protecting their own jurisdictions.
They were essentially overlapping control mechanisms, and despite the horrific nature of their work, that specific structural design, having multiple independent sensors constantly monitoring the environment and monitoring each other, locked the system in place.
It prevented an internal collapse because no single faction could move without the others detecting it.
It's a cold, calculated view of systems design. You do not rely on the goodness, the loyalty, or the morality of the people in power.
You rely on the friction between their competing interests to keep the machine stable. You use their mutual distrust as the stabilizing force.
And this brings us to one of the most compelling aspects of designing an optimal system: understanding the material we are working with. If we are building a machine for humans to operate, we have to understand the statistical realities of human nature.
Right. You cannot build a bridge out of steel if you design it, assuming it has the physical properties of rubber. It will collapse under its own weight. You have to know the material.
And the analysis breaks down humanity using a very pragmatic statistical model, the 80-10-10 rule.
It begins by identifying the extremes of human behavior. At one end of the spectrum, you have roughly 5 to 10% of the population who are inherently malicious, manipulative, or possess traits we associate with psychopathy or sociopathy.
They lack empathy and will act in bad faith regardless of what rules you put in place.
And on the exact opposite end, you have another 5 to 10% who are, for lack of a better term, saints. They are highly moral individuals.
But we must carefully clarify how they operate.
Yes. These people follow their internal moral compass. They will do what they believe is inherently right and just, regardless of what the system incentivizes.
So they don't just blindly follow the law, they follow their ethics. If the law is unjust, their internal compass dictates their actions.
Exactly. So you have 10% who are malicious and 10% who are saints. That leaves the vast majority of humanity.
The remaining 80 to 90%, the plasticine majority.
Yes, the adaptable middle. This vast majority is neither inherently purely good nor inherently purely bad. They are simply practical.
They will mold their behavior to fit whatever environment they are placed in.
They look at the rules of the system, they figure out what behaviors are rewarded and what behaviors are punished, and they adapt accordingly to survive and thrive.
Which means the entire design of a political system rests entirely on how you handle this 80%. If we look back at history, we see massive structural failures when system designers misunderstand this group.
Utopian ideologies like communism or extreme libertarianism attempt to build systems that rely on everyone acting like the 10% of saints. They assume inherent goodness and selflessness.
And when that inevitably fails because the 80% act out of self-interest, systems often overcorrect.
They build deeply authoritarian structures based on the fear of the 10% of psychopaths, treating everyone as a potential criminal. Both approaches fail because they ignore the reality of the plasticine majority.
So how do you manage them? How do you build a machine for the 80%?
An optimal system must be designed so that the plasticine majority finds it personally profitable and socially advantageous to emulate the saints rather than the corrupt.
You do not need to embark on some impossible crusade to change human nature. You just need to change the incentive structure.
If the system rigorously rewards transparency and effectively punishes corruption, perhaps through the vigilance of that fourth control branch, the plasticine majority will act transparently.
Not because they are suddenly morally pure, but because it is the most advantageous way to operate. You make honesty profitable.
It's applied behavioral economics. But changing the rules of a system is one thing. Changing the deeply ingrained culture of a nation is another.
If a country has been steeped in corruption for decades, how long does it take for this new plasticine behavior to solidify into a true, unthinking cultural norm?
Changing the rules changes behavior immediately, simply because people adapt to avoid punishment or gain rewards. But changing the actual mentality of a culture takes time.
There is a very specific timeline for this, the three-generation rule.
It takes roughly 60 years for a new systemic rule to rewrite a society's mentality.
Let's break down those three generations.
Good.
Generation 1 is the group that experiences the rule change firsthand.
Yes, Generation 1 behaves honestly, but only because they have to. Internally, they might still harbor the old, corrupt mentality.
They might grumble about the new transparency laws in private, but their outward actions are compliant because the system enforces it.
Then you have Generation 2. They grew up watching their parents behave honestly. The parents might still complain privately, but the children only observe the compliant, transparent behavior as they are developing.
So Generation 2 behaves honestly because it is what their parents did. It is the established norm of their childhood environment.
Exactly. And finally, you reach Generation 3. They are raised by parents who fully accepted the new norms as standard practice.
Generation 3 doesn't just behave honestly. They believe it is inherently, unquestioningly right. The external rule implemented 60 years ago has become internalized cultural DNA.
Which is a powerful reminder that the cultural and political frustrations we experience today are likely the delayed result of systemic rules implemented decades ago. We're living in the cultural downstream of previous engineers.
This leads us to the culmination of this entire deep dive. Having diagnosed the flaws, mapped the system with cybernetics, and analyzed the human material, what are the actual blueprints? We're going to take our time and walk through the final axioms for an optimal system.
These axioms are the foundational rules the machine must operate by. The first axiom represents a complete philosophical shift regarding the very purpose of the state. It states clearly, government must minimize misfortune.
Minimize misfortune, not maximize happiness.
Exactly. This is a direct challenge to the utopian traps we see throughout history. Whether it's a state promising a worker's paradise or a system promising total individual fulfillment, governments often claim their goal is to make you happy.
But happiness is an internal, deeply personal state. A government cannot force you to be happy.
But a government can very easily make you miserable.
Precisely. It can make you miserable through its direct actions, like passing unjust laws, heavy-handed policing, or oppression.
And it can make you equally miserable through its negligent inactions, like failing to provide basic security, ignoring failing infrastructure, or allowing people to fall below minimum survival standards.
Therefore, the optimal system completely abandons the arrogant, impossible goal of maximizing happiness and focuses entirely on the practical, measurable goal of minimizing misfortune.
That sets a very grounded baseline. The second axiom is perhaps the most radical departure from our current democratic norms: proportional decision-making.
This is a direct mechanical fix for the winner-takes-all flaw we discussed regarding the permanent minority.
The premise here is a mathematical approach to representation and power. If a specific minority group makes up exactly 3% of the population, they should get to decide exactly 3% of the legislative outcomes.
Okay, let's test that, because logistically that sounds chaotic. How does a 3% minority get 3% of the power? If a parliament votes on a bill, it either passes or it doesn't. You can't pass 3% of a law.
It requires a fundamental rethinking of how parliamentary power is distributed over time, rather than on a single vote. In our current system, if you are a 3% minority, you lose every vote, every single time, because you are perpetually outvoted. You have 0% of the power.
Proportional decision-making argues that the system must algorithmically ensure that power is distributed across the aggregate of decisions. A majority of 80% should get their way 80% of the time, not 100% of the time.
The specific mechanisms for achieving this vary, but the axiom demands that the permanent misery of marginalized groups is structurally eliminated. Every citizen, no matter how small their demographic, must be genuinely part of the people who rule.
It eliminates the concept of the permanent loser. Moving from representation to the economic sphere, the next axiom addresses risk versus speculation. This gets into the mechanics of wealth, taxation, and societal contribution.
It states that true entrepreneurial risk must be treated as hard labor. The act of building a business, creating jobs, investing time, physical effort, and personal capital is highly valuable to the system.
Because it drives the engine forward, this type of entrepreneurial labor should be taxed minimally to encourage growth and innovation.
But how does that differ from just making money on the stock market? Doesn't the system want to invest?
It does, but it draws a very sharp distinction between entrepreneurial labor and pure market speculation.
Simply buying stocks in a well-established company or algorithmic day trading and sitting back to wait for dividends requires no actual labor and creates no new tangible value for the state. Therefore, this passive speculation must be heavily taxed.
So you're using the tax code not just for revenue, but as a behavioral control mechanism.
Exactly. It is a fiscal mechanism designed to actively reward actual societal contribution while curbing the parasitic accumulation of wealth. By taxing speculation heavily and labor lightly, you avoid the extreme wealth disparities that inevitably lead to violent redistributions. You balance the economic engine.
And finally, the axiom that addresses the competence problem. We talked about how both direct democracy and representative democracy fail when the people pulling the levers don't understand the machinery.
How do we structurally ensure that representatives actually know what they're doing before they take power?
The solution involves looking back to ancient Rome. The axiom proposes a strict hierarchy of proven competence, modeled on the Roman cursus honorum.
The path of honors. You couldn't just wake up one day in Rome, give a great speech, and become consul.
Precisely. The cursus honorum was the sequential order of public offices held by aspiring politicians in the Roman Republic. You couldn't skip steps.
This axiom argues that our modern representatives must prove themselves in a similar strict hierarchy. Before a politician is allowed anywhere near national policy or the federal budget, they must first successfully serve at the lowest, most granular levels of local governance.
No steeping steps based on charisma or wealth. You have to prove you can manage a local municipal budget, fix the potholes, and manage city zoning before you are allowed to touch the national treasury.
In Rome, you started as an aedile, organizing public games and maintaining city streets. It was practical, observable work. If you proved competent at that level, you might eventually run for praetor, handling judicial duties.
And only much later in life, after decades of proven, observable service, could you become consul.
The axiom demands that a system structurally mandate this kind of proven competence, filtering out the charismatic but fundamentally incompetent candidates who currently flood modern parliaments.
So, what does this all mean? We have journeyed from the basic, flawed definition of the people all the way to engineering the state like a complex cybernetic refrigerator with sensors, actuators, and negative feedback loops.
We've looked at the sticky fingers of beekeepers, the VAR room of government, and the Roman path of competence.
It means that we need to fundamentally shift our perspective. We need to stop viewing our political frustrations as merely the result of bad people making bad choices. When you encounter gridlock, rampant corruption, or staggering bureaucratic incompetence, you are being asked to view them not as moral failings of the society, but as simple, fixable engineering flaws in the machine.
If the refrigerator is too warm and your food is spoiling, you don't stand there and yell at the milk. You fix the thermostat, you repair the compressor, or you install a new sensor.
It is a profoundly empowering way to look at society. It takes the mystery out of it. It removes the helpless feeling of partisan politics. The machine was built by humans, which means it can be diagnosed, deconstructed, and redesigned by humans.
And I will leave you with a final, lingering thought to mull over. We discussed the assertion that the vast majority of human mentality is simply plasticine, shaped entirely by the incentive structures of the system they live in.
And we noted the timeline, that it takes exactly 3 generations, or roughly 60 years, to completely rewrite a culture's DNA.
Look at the prevailing cultural and political mentalities we are experiencing right now in our daily lives. If the 3-generation rule holds true, what specific systemic rules implemented by the political architects of the 1960s are dictating our behavior today? Who are we currently emulating without even realizing it?
That is something to truly think about. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the systems around you, keep looking for the sensors, and we will see you next time.